się przyśni i wszystkie słowa.
When the USSR was collapsing in the early 1990s, two Russian diplomats created the concept, later called the Falin-Kvinchinsky Doctrine. This doctrine went down in history under the shorter and more understandable name gas pipelines instead of tanks. The point of this doctrine was to ensure that countries that were just freeing themselves from the influence of the evil empire remained under the influence of Russia, which made them dependent not only on its military forces, secret services, and political influence, but first of all on energy sources. In 1990, the German press published an article based on a leak from Moscow. It contained fragments of a document presenting what was then called the Falin-Kvinchinsky Doctrine. Valentin Falin was the head of the Foreign Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Yuli Kvinchinsky was the Soviet ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. The project was to replace Soviet tanks with pipelines and, with the help of dependence on oil and gas supplies, maintain Moscow's influence in Poland, Czechoslovakia and other countries of the former communist bloc. This building is, in a sense, a monument to the whole gas pipelines instead of tanks doctrine, and also, in a sense, to the reset policy. It was built in 2000, but the construction has never been completed because the government in Russia changed at the very beginning of its construction. This caused a whole lot of perturbations, including political ones, which ultimately led to Russia itself fighting with the shareholders of Europolgas, as evidenced by Vladimir Putin in Sopot in 2009 when he directly addressed the public opinion regarding this company. Prime Minister Putin expressed the suspicion that Alexander Gudzovati obtained his position in Europolgas in a corrupt manner. Responding to the interlocutor's statement, Prime Minister Tusk informed that the Polish side had already decided to exclude the above-mentioned entity from Europolgas. At one time, we built a network of pipelines through the territory of Poland, and we had agreements saying that the ownership of this system is 50-50 between Russian and Polish companies. And there was a natural person who had a 4% share, and this investment was 100% carried out by the Russian side. The corruption aspect of this case probably needs to be addressed.
Pewnie trzeba się zająć kwestią korupcyjną tej sprawy.
Надо посмотреть на коррупционность этого решения, причем с обеих сторон.
Today, after 23 years, there is almost nothing left in the building. And soon there will be nothing here except apartment buildings, quite close to the centre of Warsaw.
Centrum Warszawy.
Kiedy toczyły się debaty w Polsce dotyczące natury transformacji.
When the political system transition debate was on in Poland, initially on the outskirts of public discourse, so to say, and then within the mainstream discourse, meetings and discussions were held in Germany between the Soviet and German diplomats.
niemieckimi. No, wówczas powstała taka koncepcja,
A
doktryna.
concept was developed then called the Falin-Kwieciński doctrine, which later, peripheralistically nicknamed gas pipes in place of tanks. It was already then that concepts were developed that translated into the praxis as the Cold War was fading away, based on the replacement of sheer military influence for energy or power-related influence.
Zamiany wpływów tych czysto militarnych na wpływy energetyczne, co się przerodziło później w koncepcję Nord Stream.
This was finally transformed into the Nord Stream 2 concept based on 100 billion euros transferred from Germany to the Russian Federation, against the background of the overall geopolitical Lisbon to Vladivostok concept.
Z jakiego powodu
What was the actual reason behind this particular idea?
został zrealizowany w pewnym sensie? No bo on zrealizowany został, to symboliczne wysadzenie.
It was carried out in a sense. Remember that symbolic blowing up of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which marked the project's end, or perhaps suspension. But yes, why has it all emerged? Why on earth should the world have believed that a country led by a certain Vladimir Putin, former KGB colonel, would ever be something qualitatively different from that ruled by former Cheka men?
Myślenie sformatowała ta wizja Fukuyamy. Ona ma
The world so believed as our thinking had been formatted by that version proposed by Fukuyama. This concept was indeed profoundly grounded upon certain classical liberal assumptions that boiled down to some beliefs typical of the Enlightenment. In short, human nature is the same everywhere. Consequently, the principles related to human nature, social institutions, and systems are identical, regardless of the place. Hence, with similar circumstances occurring, be it peaceful cooperation, a world of this sort might indeed be expected.
Podobne okoliczności, no chociażby pokojowa współpraca, no to rzeczywiście takiego świata można oczekiwać.
This rather joyful perspective was expected to be put an end to all the previous, mostly very rough and painful human experiences. If someone had placed a bet on a different prospect, they would admittedly expect the implementation of a very different program. As we know, the idea that Russian gas be sold to Western Europe was well ahead, a good dozen years ahead of the downfall of the Iron Curtain.
Innego programu, o którym pan już wspomniał, no my wiemy, że ten pomysł, żeby sprzedawać...
It was conceived based on what I remember, not being particularly keen on the topic then, in the 1970s. It was a Russian or Soviet conception of a way of penetrating into Western Europe, especially Germany, in correlation with neutralizing the element called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an old Soviet yearning.
Rosyjska, sowiecka wtedy, przenikania do Europy Zachodniej, przede wszystkim do Niemiec, stawiająca na neutralizację tego elementu wtedy przecież Sojuszu Północnoatlantyckiego. To stara tęsknota sowiecka. My pamiętamy w Polsce.
In Poland, we remember the Adam Rapacki plan, those ideas of Khrushchev, which were meant to bring about peaceful unification of Germany at the expense of the Austrian option. That is, complete neutrality, with West Germany picked out over NATO. This was intuitively an attractive prospect for Germany, and this is what it obviously was. Now, back to the period of our interest, the years preceding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A counterpart of Russia's offer we're discussing was the Wandel durch Handel assumption, pretty enthusiastically propagated by the German business circles. Isn't that right?
Entuzjastycznie promowane przez biznes niemiecki.
Meaning, if we increasingly do business with Russia as it is, Russia will be changing, gradually becoming pluralistic, open, liberal and democratic.
Coraz bardziej pluralistyczna, coraz bardziej otwarta, coraz bardziej liberalna, coraz bardziej demokratyczna.
Ale pańskim zdaniem...
In your opinion, did those pursuing such policies and dialogue with Russia actually believe in all that? Or did they simply use the phrase as a buzz term, or for the sake of excusing themselves, perhaps?
Psychologiczne, one są...
I'd rather leave aside such psychological considerations. I would assume they began psychologically believing in what they were doing in quite a counterintuitive manner. I talked to members of various German think tanks, and one of them once told me, "You know, we don't have a tradition here in Germany of defending human rights." From the very beginning of building a policy of talks with Russia, such as it is, the issue of gas agreements were one of the main points of discussion between representatives of both sides. This can be seen in a whole series of documents that were created in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the turn of 2007 and 2008, including notes and test materials with which the Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski and then Prime Minister Donald Tusk travelled to Moscow for their first talks.
Ówczesny premier Donald Tusk.
As a recipient of Russian energy raw materials, we would like to continue and develop cooperation with the Russian Federation in this area. We treat our desire to diversify supplies in terms of searching for such forms of cooperation with all interested countries that are optimal from the European point of view. This is how the matter looks in the documents from the conversation between Prime Minister Tusk and President Vladimir Putin in February 2008. Vladimir Putin insisted that Poland recognize the validity of building the Baltic gas pipeline, pointing to the benefits it would bring to the whole of Europe. However, Prime Minister Donald Tusk maintained the opinion that the Amber project would be cheaper and more effective. In turn, the Russian president, commenting on the issue of resuming oil deliveries by land to Mazelkai, promised that he would talk to Lukoil's management on this matter. The documents that are still kept in the chancellery of the Prime Minister, such as this personal letter from then Prime Minister Tusk to Vladimir Putin, who is changing his position from the office of President to the office of Prime Minister, mentioned directly the topic of gas, and specifically gas pipelines understood as a platform for understanding between Poland and Russia. Continuing to treat Russia as an important partner of the European Union, also in the context of energy cooperation, Poland is interested in stable supplies of Russian oil and gas. We believe that the EU-Russian energy dialogue is conducive to developing clear rules of cooperation. That is why we try to actively participate in it. Poland's proposals regarding energy projects are aimed at ensuring transparent rules for cooperation between suppliers and customers and strengthening the trust between them. We believe that in this sensitive area, solutions that would create the impression that they are direct against anyone should be avoided. In this case, we assume that the concept of diversification of suppliers is directly related to the concept of diversification of recipients, and the common denominator of these concepts is a developed network of oil and gas pipelines. During my visit to Moscow, I had the impression that the Russian side received our arguments in this context, including the proposals for the Polish side to participate in the modernization of the section of the Druzhba pipeline to the refinery in Maskiai, which I think bodes well for the future. From the very beginning, gas issues were analysed in three main areas. The first concerned the Nord Stream gas pipeline, which was in the organisational phase, but already quite advanced, and was being built jointly by Germany and the Russian Federation. Poland was consistently opposed to its construction and implementation, and the Polish head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when he was still a minister of the previous government, called this project the second Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The second issue, which concerned gas and was within the government's competences, was the matter of a building of an LNG terminal in Świnoujście, i.e. the so-called gas port. The third and the most important issue concerned the matters for which Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy, Waldemar Pawlak, was directly responsible in the government. They involved negotiations on the extension of a large gas contract supplying the lion's share of the gas we used in Poland, gas flowing from Russia. We have a long-term contract contract concerning deliveries via Yamal under the Yamal contract. If I remember correctly, 2020 or 2022, as President Szumski corrected me. The contract with Rosukrenergo expires in 2009. Now we have a proposal from the Russian side to link the change of the nature of the contract to a long-term contract with a change in the intergovernmental agreement.
Cały problem gazowy między Polską a
The entire gas problem between Poland and Russia during the rule of Prime Minister Donald Tusk resulted basically from two circumstances.
Po pierwsze z
First,
aktualizacji
from
umowy
the renewal of the gas agreement from 1993 and the need to update some of the provisions of this agreement.
A druga kwestia dotyczyła
And the second issue concerned increasing, as it was called professionally, the volume of Russian gas supplies to Poland.
do Polski. Cała rozgrywka związana jest z sytuacją kryzysową, która nastąpiła w styczniu 2009 roku.
The entire game is related to the crisis that occurred in January 2009, because the Russians then stopped gas supplies to Poland. The argument here was the Russian-Ukrainian conflict over gas.
Przypomnę, że jeśli się nie mylę, 1/3.
Let me remind you that, if I'm not mistaken, a third of Russian gas supplies to Poland, and in this sense serviced by Europolgas, this supply went through the Ukrainian direction.
I Rosjanie parli do tego, żeby
And the Russians pushed for some intensification of these talks and the final adoption of some form of agreement and the signing of a new gas agreement between Poland and Russia.
a Rosją.
Turning off the gas tap on New Year's Day had become a tradition. Russia has fulfilled its threats and the Ukrainians are once again afraid what the coming days will bring. There is still no contract for gas supplies to Ukraine this year, and therefore there is no reason for it to be sent there now. However, the Russians still send gas to the west, including to Poland, by the pipeline running through Ukraine. The government assures that we do not have to worry about restrictions on gas supplies to Polish households, although supplies via the Ukrainian gas pipeline have decreased by almost 85%. When it comes to industry, however, large consumers of this fuel may have problems. Lech Kaczynski says the EU should side with Ukraine in the gas dispute. The EU should also be more decisive in other matters in relations with our Russian partner. The head of our diplomacy warns. Poland should not take a position that could inflame the conflict. In the political reality of the first years of reset, energy policy, especially gas policy, was the subject of interest and actions taken by President Lech Kaczynski. His policy focused on creating alternative possibilities for supplying gas to Poland from directions other than the Russian Federation.
niż Federacja Rosyjska.
We need the gas port for strategic reasons. I hope it will be built very soon.
Prezydent Lech Kaczyński był politykiem prozachodnim.
President Lech Kaczynski was a Western politician in the full sense of the word, and in geopolitical realities, this meant saying goodbye to Poland's dependence on the politics or geopolitics of pipelines, which was implemented primarily by Vladimir Putin.
Przede wszystkim Władimir Putin. Zresztą Rosjanie tą politykę.
Besides, the Russians have been implementing this policy since the 1990s. I also looked at this matter from the perspective of materials regarding Yeltsin's policy and the Polish-Russian relations in the 1990s.
Od początku była elementem nacisku.
This issue has simply been an element of Russian strategy's pressure on Poland from the very beginning. Well, in the 2000s, this issue simply became one of the most important in Russian policy towards Poland.
Trzeba powiedzieć, że rząd Donalda Tuska
It must be said that Donald Tusk's government was looking for various, so to speak, concepts, but all of them, in one form or another, fit into the concept of the Russian policy.
koncepcji polityki rosyjskiej.
There will undoubtedly be a need to replace the short-term contract that expires in 2009 with Rosukrenergo for over 2 billion deliveries per year.
Ten konflikt
We believe that this conflict is an argument in favor of the pipeline, in favor of completing the Yamal investment that runs through Poland, i.e. in favor of building the second line of the Yamal pipeline, as well in favor of the Nabucco pipeline. It wants to have cheaper gas and not some investments that might make money for foreign suppliers again, but from other directions. According to the studies and graphics used by officials of Donald Tusk's government at that time, this state of affairs was to last for the next decades. To understand the context in which the subsequent attempts to make Poland energy independent from Russia took place, we need to go back to 2001. At the end of that year, a new government was formed in Poland, created by two groups, the Democratic Left Alliance and the Polish People's Party. A contract prepared for implementation, which was to provide Poland with gas delivered over the bottom of the Baltic Sea from Norway, was just waiting to be sent to partners, because the previous Conservative government had prepared the investments for implementation. Gas supply from an additional second source, which is the basis for energy security. It is the breaking of the supply monopoly from only one source. It may turn out that after signing all these agreements, there is too much gas for Poland. Of course, all these contracts will be checked. The contract was more of a propaganda idea. Before this investment was buried by the government of the Democratic Left Alliance, it was prepared by Piotr Naimski in the previous government.
W 2001 roku, kiedy połączenie Polski z Norwegią...
In 2001, when the connection of Poland with Norway via a gas pipeline was agreed, contracts were signed, and all that was needed was to send the documents, already approved by the management board in Poland, the supervisory board, the ministry, to Copenhagen and Oslo. But then there was the election, and Leszek Miller didn't do it. SLD did not want this project. SLD withdrew from it for various reasons.
SLD odstąpiło od niego na zasadzie różnych pretekstów.
Rząd Leszka Millera.
The government of Leszek Miller, the SLD government, signed another extension of gas supplies via the Yamal pipeline with the Russians.
Miller wysłał do Moskwy wicepremiera Pola.
Miller sent Deputy Prime Minister Pol to Moscow with a mission to basically extend the Yamal contract.
Przedłużyć kontrakt jamalski. Pol podpisał kolejną wersję.
Pol signed another version of these gas agreements. In practice, this meant that the amount of gas supplied by Russia to Poland under the long-term contract was slightly reduced.
Dostarczona przez Rosję do Polski z kontraktu długoterminowego została obniżona nieco, a ta luka została oddana
This gap was given to an intermediary company called Roskukrenergo, which was a vehicle used by the Russians to pay their people, because they were trusted people who created this company.
Opłacać swoich ludzi. Bo to byli zaufani ludzie, którzy...
They received this gas, sold this gas to PGING and made a profit along the way.
Mieli z tego zysk.
After 4 years, however, in an atmosphere of scandal, the post-communist left loses power. It's taken over after Lech Kaczynski's victory in the presidential elections by the Law and Justice Party, which returns to the concept of this gas pipeline. We started such a project in 2006 and 2007, again in consultation with the Danes and Norwegians. This time, it was a project of several companies, both Norwegian and Danish, as well as ours. And again, Tusk did not continue this project. He didn't want it, thinking it unnecessary.
Tusk nie kontynuował, nie chciał go, uważając, że to jest niepotrzebne.
Lech Kaczynski's victory also allowed the construction of a gas port to be launched, another investment making Poland independent from Russian gas.
Decyzja o budowie gazoportu w
The decision to build a gas port in Świnoujście was taken at the beginning of 2006, and the initiator of this project was President Lech Kaczynski.
To zostało sformalizowane.
It was formalized by the government, and they did what, as it was necessary. The assumption was from the very beginning that this gas terminal would actually allow us, if not completely, replace Russian imports, at least to become independent to a very large extent. This meant that the gas port would be able to import 5 billion cubic meters of gas, and then, after expansion, 7.5 or even 1 billion cubic meters of gas.
Potem po rozbudowie 7,5, a nawet więcej miliardów metrów sześciennych gazu. Rozpoczęliśmy ten projekt.
We started this project. The election of 2007, lost by the Law and Justice Party and won by the Civic Platform, interrupted those activities.
Przerwały te działania. Rząd Donalda Tuska.
Donald Tusk's government started this project with a year's delay. In 2008, they came to the conclusion that they would build it after all. All right. It was already a delay. It was already a real delay because an interruption of the works results in multiplied delays. Of course, this is what also happened with that project.
Też tak się stało.
Energy issues, including gas issues, and especially the attitude towards Russian gas, were the background of the then emerging conflict between the president and the government. The government was looking for an agreement with Russia. The president was looking for solutions that would bypass Russia. The head of President Lech Kaczynski's cabinet at that time was Maciej Łapinski. What was the political thought behind it? This was the so-called southeastern chain. Well, Lech Kaczynski tried to establish, through Ukraine, Georgia, the Black Sea to Azerbaijan, this new channel for transporting energy resources to Poland, independent of the Northern Canal.
Surowców energetycznych do Polski, niezależny od tego kanału północnego, bo
because Poland's energy security was extremely important for him. Poland's global security in general. Yes, he made sure that this direction was up to date, so that the pipeline from Azerbaijan to Poland could be launched.
Był aktualny, żeby można było doprowadzić do uruchomienia rurociągu z Azerbejdżanu do Polski. To zresztą było...
This was watched very closely by the Russians. I remember that when we were in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, Prime Minister Frapkov appeared in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
I w Kazachstanie, w Uzbekistanie i w Turkmenii pojawił się premier Fratkow, a kiedy była konferencja...
And when there was a conference in Krakow, Putin probably went to Turkmenia to keep his finger on the pulse too. They also thought that. The Russians also believed that energy security was an important component of state security in general.
Jest istotnym komponentem bezpieczeństwa państwa w ogóle.
Energy security is crucial for Poland's future. This may be ensured by the construction of an oil pipeline from Central Asia through Odessa, Brody to Gdansk. This initiative requires cooperation with, among others, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia and Azerbaijan. That's why the presidents of these countries came to Krakow. The result is a joint message that includes specific items, establishing a working group and support for the idea of a joint enterprise. I'm extremely glad that this has happened because Poland wants to take an active part as a buyer country, a transit country. I asked Mr. Donald Tusk to take the floor. The election lost by the Law and Justice Party in 2007 causes another change in energy priorities. Talks with Russia, such as it is, are quickly also becoming talks about energy. When asked years later about the abandoned Norwegian gas pipeline, Donald Tusk will say these words: "We have important Russian contracts. So it is obvious that we do not need much of this Norwegian gas. Therefore, the Polish market is too small for Norway to invest in such a huge undertaking as a gas pipeline." Shifting energy priorities to the east has left Poland in a situation with no alternative. Poland formally opposed the construction of the Nord Stream gas pipeline. But apart from expressing dissatisfaction with this matter, it did not take any real action to stop its implementation. It resigned from building its own gas pipeline on the bottom of the Baltic Sea and started the investment in the gas port with a delay. Under such circumstances, Minister of Economy, Waldemar Pawlak, submits a request to Prime Minister Donald Tusk to start negotiations on a new gas supply from Russia. I request consent to commence negotiations concerning an additional protocol to the agreement between the government of the Republic of Poland and the government of the Russian Federation on the construction of a gas pipeline system for the transit of Russian gas through the territory of the Republic of Poland and the supply of Russian gas to the Republic of Poland for the approval of the attached draft negotiation instructions.
Między lutym a listopadem 2009 roku polska strona, czy polski
Between February and November 2009, the Polish side, or the Polish government, Prime Minister Tusk, empowered the Minister of Economy, Waldemar Pawlak, to conduct talks with the Russians on behalf of Poland, on behalf of the Polish government.
Pierwsza w lutym, druga w lipcu i
During this time, 3 negotiation instructions were created. The first in February, the second in July, and the third in November. The first one is, one might say, generally accepted. It specifies a volume of 8 to 9 billion cubic meters of gas transferred to Poland annually. But the subsequent instructions, especially the one from November 2009, raised concerns. It later became the subject of an in-depth analysis by the Supreme Audit Office and, to a large extent, the criticism from the Supreme Audit Office regarding the manner of negotiating the gas agreement between Poland and Russia concerns the provisions from November 2009. There is simply an increase in the volume of gas supplies to 11 billion cubic meters. The weak negotiating position of the Polish team was also related to Poland's dependence on natural gas supplies from the east due to the long-term lack of investments in interconnections with Western Europe. This was effectively used by the Russian side, which, during the negotiations, submitted new demands expanding the scope of matters to be negotiated, and effectively extended the negotiation period by not agreeing to initiating agreements in a shape that would not be consistent with its interests. The Polish side, not having an established strategy, did not use its arguments and accepted subsequent demands from the Russian side.
Co ciekawe, to niezwykle istotne, w międzyczasie dochodzi do całej serii wymiany listów.
And interestingly enough, this is extremely important. In the meantime, a whole series of letters are exchanged between President Lech Kaczynski and Prime Ministers Donald Tusk and Waldemar Pawlak. The Polish President, President Lech Kaczynski, demanded information on how the increase in the volume of gas supplies to Poland related to the issue of Poland becoming independent from Russian gas and the issue of building an LNG terminal in Świnoujście. On the 10th of April 2010, Lech Kaczynski was killed. On the same day, Waldemar Pawlak received a letter from Igor Sechin. We read in it that the death of President Kaczynski should not change the agreements concluded between Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk. In this difficult hour, I would like to emphasize my readiness for further active cooperation with you in order to develop the Russian-Polish cooperation in the energy field in the implementation of large-scale agreements reached by the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Poland, Donald Tusk. In a later report by the Supreme Audit Office, we read that at meetings of the Council of Ministers, neither Donald Tusk nor Vladimir Pavlak could answer questions about the reasons why Poland sought to sign an agreement with Russia for as long as until 2037. At the meeting of the Council of Ministers on the 13th of July 2010, the Minister of the Economy was unable to explain the reasons for establishing the validity periods of the contract for gas supplies until 2017 and of that for gas transmission until 2045. The signing of the agreement, which was to be in force until 2037, was stopped by the European Commission, which, at the last stage, decided that such negotiations were dangerous for the European Union itself. Ultimately, Igor Sechin and Vladimir Pavlak signed in Warsaw an agreement that made Poland dependent on Russian gas until 2022. The Deputy Prime Ministers of Poland and Russia signed a gas agreement. The agreement was signed even though the European Commission had not yet given the green light. There is no real alternative to large deliveries from our country. That's why we see prospects for the future. However, energy competition issues are not limited to gas. When, as a result of changes of power in the Kremlin, Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Yukos collapsed and Putin locked him in a cage. A chance to take over the Mazekai refinery in Lithuania appeared in the courtroom. President Lech Kaczynski decided to take advantage of this opportunity. The goal is, on the one hand, energy independence, and, on the other hand, what is the basic reference point for Lithuania and for Poland? Poland's base plane of reference is Europe. To count in Europe, we must be together, also with other countries. This is something that strongly unites us and shows us that here in the centre and in the Middle East of Europe, we could say in Central and Eastern Europe, you can act on your own, bypassing all sorts of powers that make it possible. When, in the summer of 2006, it became clear that PKN Orlen was head of Russian companies in the race to buy Mazekai, there was a mysterious failure of this particular installation supplying Russian oil to the plant. We learned about what kind of failure it was much later from cable releases by WikiLeaks. According to American diplomats, these failures were ordered by Igor Sechin, Vladimir Putin's right-hand man, who issued such orders in early July. The oil itself stopped flowing to Mazekai on the 29th of July 2006, allegedly as a result of a failure. Russia is seeking to take over important parts of the Republic of Poland's oil sector. Representatives of Russian energy sector companies admit in unofficial talks that the decision to cut off oil supplies to the Mazekai refinery in 2006 was of a political nature, which would confirm the WikiLeaks revelations from January this year about the role of the Deputy Minister of the Russian Federation, Igor Sechin, in this matter. On the 12th of October 2006, Konstantin Kosachev, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Russian Duma, visited Vilnius. At the end of his visit to Lithuania, he told journalists that by selling Mazekai to Poles, Lithuania was making a mistake. because from that moment on, the refinery in Mazikiai would not be able to operate stably. Literally a few hours later, a fire breaks out in Mazikiai, and as a result, this tower, this part of the installation, collapses and falls in this direction, demolishing a large part of the infrastructure and limiting the production capacity of this plant for many months by almost half. The fire broke out yesterday afternoon. The burning part of the plant was closed and most of the employees were evacuated. First, the fuel oil processing device caught fire. There was an explosion. After that, the 50-meter tower collapsed. Fire is not the only problem in Mazikiai. In July, the Russians turned off the oil tap to the refinery. The official reason for blocking supplies via the Friendship pipeline was its failure and renovation. The unofficial one was revenge for losing to Poland in the competition for the Lithuanian refinery. Subsequent perturbations in relations with Russian Federation when it tried to impede the operation of the refinery in Mazikiai and the ensuing political tensions between Poland and Lithuania made the operation of this refinery difficult in many different ways. The problems concerned both the railway network, which was supposed to enable the transport of products outside Lithuania towards Latvia, and the issues related to crude oil supplies. Ultimately, the changes that took place in European energy policy included a set of sanctions, and above all, the Russian attack on Ukraine have opened up opportunities for radical actions related to energy security. Igor Sechin stated that the Russian Federation proposes cooperation based on the principle of mutual benefits in the following areas: A. Crude oil, a long-term contract for the supply of crude oil to Orlen; B. Investment cooperation in Mazikiai, and solving the problems of oil supplies to this refinery. The pipe that entered the refinery in Mazikiai supplied Russian crude oil for years. It was processed in the refinery into fuels that could be purchased at gas stations. But all the work carried out in recent years has made it possible to become independent from Russian energy resources. This pipe could have simply been sealed, making not only the plant in Mazikiai in Lithuania, but also the countries in this part of the world more independent from the Russian energy blackmail. The Russian concept of domination over Central Europe, Poland, other countries, the Baltic states, using the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, or the entire network of gas pipelines that were supposed to reach the West through Ukraine and Poland, was defeated due to one issue: the shale gas revolution. As a result, both oil and gas could be sold much cheaper to Europe and to Poland. Among other things, for this to happen, two things were necessary. Firstly, the existing gas port infrastructure, and secondly, the political will to buy gas and the opportunity to sell gas. These two things combined caused the gas pipelines instead of tanks concept to collapse. Ted Garish, a man who held key positions in the administrations of several US presidents, took part in this entire process and, among other things, dealt with this matter personally.
They began with a number of, this is back in 2017, when they began the process of beginning to buy natural gas from the United States. And natural gas in the United States, it really was booming in this century, when they discovered that they could frack for gas and also associated gas could come on the market. As a result of that, what happened is that these products became available to the world, and Poland recognized very early on they really, I don't know if they get enough credit for that, but very early on they recognized the need to be free of Russian influence. And our gas did not come with any, there were no requirements. In other words, you bought it at the price, in the market price, and we made it available, and companies made it available for the long term.
This installation is an LNG terminal located on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in the United States, in the state of Louisiana, or simply a gas port. It's part of the global energy infrastructure that is responsible for pumping gas onto ships that transport it, among others to Poland. From this place, 5.5 million tons of gas reach Świnoujście annually. This is a significant part of our demand, a significant part of our imports, but above all, one of the absolutely key elements of our energy security.
It seems to me that it was probably the first thing. It was good economically for both Poland and the U.S. I mean, basically, this was a good deal for both countries. And we were able to take advantage of Poland's needs at the time and the U.S. ability to satisfy those needs in the marketplace. Now, in terms of geopolitics, it had the advantage of allowing Russia to get off any particular requirements from Russia. So that was an additional advantage. But they really took the opportunity to it was an interesting time. They took the opportunity to really make a difference, I think, for the people of Poland and the people of Louisiana and Texas, too. The way I think the Russians were, basically, I think they poo-pooed the idea that the United States was going to be able to supply this market. And I think in terms of price, they just thought we could never meet that challenge. And I mean, the way they were going to do it, they may have been selling the gas under market in order to have that cash flow. And you know, you can do that for a while. But I mean, sooner or later you have to give that up. So we know that they were in the market, but I mean, I think our concept was to really get the relationship with the Polish government and the U.S. government, which we did on meeting after meeting with our secretaries, both at the time Perry and then Briette, would go over there, and we met with everyone, and it was a deal that was made in heaven, as we say. It was made to be, and it had the tremendous advantage. I think it really brought Poland and the U.S. closer together.
The entry of the Americans into the European gas market was essentially a disaster for the Russian Federation and Germany, because the entire plan, the entire strategy related to, among others, the construction of the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines came down to the fact that the Russian Federation would decide on the price and availability of gas. In short, it would be able to turn off the tap on or off. The Americans decided that since they were able to produce gas cheaper and deliver it stably, this whole assumption no longer made sense. The Russians not only stopped being able to regulate the temperature in the homes of ordinary residents who use gas, but they also stopped being able to manipulate the economies of the countries to which they supplied raw materials. In this sense, the construction of a gas port in Europe made it impossible to implement the doctrine of gas pipelines instead of tanks. And this doctrine was at the source of the entire concept of the building gas and energy networks surrounding and enslaving Europe.
Sieci gazowych i energetycznych oplatających i zniewalających Europę.
The U.S. gas moved up. It was relatively, amazingly competitive with Russian gas, basically because it was associated with oil production, and it was in some ways almost considered a waste product, if you could believe it, in the United States. And you really only had to pay for the transportation and a small amount for the gas. And this was really a tremendous opportunity for Poland, and they were able to take advantage of it and began contracting with companies, and a number of companies came over to Poland to do that. And it was an extremely effective method to really eliminate the dependence on Russia.
It takes about 26 hours to fill the ship with gas at this point. This type of unit spends so much time here, 2 ships can refuel this product at the same time. And the place where we are located is extremely interesting, not only because on the horizon there is entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, where the vast majority of the gas distributed here comes from, but also due to the fact that this entire communication route has other gas ports and other elements of energy infrastructure deep inside. There is a ditch that leads to the city located inland along what, in Polish, we call a lagoon. And no one is surprised that in order to design this type of infrastructure, a piece of the Gulf Coast was dug a long time ago.
Przekopano i to już bardzo dawno temu kawałek wybrzeża Zatoki Meksykańskiej.
The Russians were going to be able to manipulate the price. And what we did here in the United States is basically offer gas at market price. And we knew that the market could beat the Russians. In other words, they would have to discount it was going to cost them money to really run the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So it was very useful for us to have the alternative competitive gas that came in from Louisiana and Texas. And that gas was actually competitive price-wise to what we thought Nord Stream 2 was going to be able to operate. But the price was going to be manipulated by the Russians in an event, and as you know, in other countries like Ukraine, they actually shut off the gas. And you can't really operate a government and relying on, for your citizens, a situation where the government has to deal with this kind of situation. So in the United States, because this is a free market-oriented operation, we were able to actually beat the price. And the gas came in with no commitments.
Presence of this ship in the LNG terminal in Louisiana is the best proof of how much the rules of the geopolitical game for energy in Europe have changed. This ship has carried liquefied gas to Europe many times over the past months and years. It also delivered it to German ports, which means that Germany, a country that, together with the Russian Federation, tried to build a common geopolitical space without the United States, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And Nord Stream was supposed to be the backbone of this space, which is now forced to do so in the post-reset reality, to use, among other things, American energy sources to maintain its own economy. This also means that it must compete for these raw materials with other countries such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia on exactly the same terms. And it no longer benefits from the political bonus provided by its special relations with the Russian Federation. This, in turn, means that the countries of Central Europe can no longer be objects of energy aggression under these conditions.
To się nazywa Cabo da Roca.
This is called Cabo da Roca, the westernmost cape of Europe. Lisbon is just over there, to the east. A common place was to stretch from Lisbon to Vladivostok.
Tak, miała się ciągnąć wspólna...
This was to be the end of the common security space, which, as part of Medvedev's proposal, was to be divided into sectors of responsibility. And the Russians, Medvedev, were not so brazen as to propose Portugal and this tip on which we stand as their sector of responsibility. But, unfortunately, they wanted to supervise the land of Poland in the whole of Central and Eastern Europe and be responsible for the security of this region.
Ziemię Polski, czy całej Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej, jak najbardziej chcieli nadzorować i odpowiadać za bezpieczeństwo tego regionu.
This is the place in which the question is worth asking about the moment reflection first aroused in Poland. Documents have appeared which stated that after several years of attempts to bring about a reset, after all those visits of Putin, Medvedev, Cyril, all those gestures, gas contracts and everything, those who were implementing it started writing documents claiming that it was all a disaster.
Ludzie, którzy to realizowali, zaczynają pisać dokumenty, w których piszą, że to wszystko jest klęska.
Moment, w którym
The moment when Wojciech Zajączkowski, one of the Prime Minister's most important associates and expert officials, was made Poland's ambassador to Russia, taking the major post, Poland's redoubt in the east, and the most important outpost from the reset standpoint. The scales fell from his eyes, so to put it. Once he took the office, Ambassador Zajączkowski wrote to the Polish Foreign Ministry's headquarters an utterly dramatic multi-page document, recently declassified at the ministry. He informed that the work of the Polish embassy in Moscow had been completely paralyzed. Second, there's quite a clear description of the fact that all the gestures made by Poland, all the reset policy concepts, were entangled in an asymmetric relationship.
Po drugie, jest to dość jednoznaczny opis tego, że wszystkie gesty wysyłane przez Polskę, wszystkie polskie koncepcje polityki resetu względem Rosji znalazły się w sytuacji asymetrycznej.
The changes taking place in Russia's home and foreign policies have created increasingly tough conditions for maintaining decent bilateral relations with this country. Owing to the increasing probability of further intensification of tensions between the Russian Federation and the West, and of the authoritarian trend in the former's foreign policies, it is necessary that Poland's policy toward Russia be reviewed for its objectives and purposes, potential, and the possible threats. Of high import for the development of the bilateral relations in the years 2013-14 or even 2015 will be the meeting of the foreign ministers within the confines of the Cooperation Strategy Committee. Since April 2011, the major channels for bilateral contacts with Russia were meetings between heads of the Senate's foreign ministers, the ministers of transport, and as part of the Economic Committee. The heads of state and of the governments, Polish ones only, participated participated in those meetings to a limited extent. In 2012, Prime Minister Tusk received the visit of Ms. Matvienko, chairwoman of the Federation Council. President Komarovsky met in 2013 with Naryshkin, head of the State Duma. While this mechanism of cooperation enabled to maintain relatively correct relations with Russia, however, without a prospect for resolving the problems of importance from Poland's viewpoint, such as the Smolensk crash affair, declassification of the Katyn massacre documentation, the Augustov roundup, reality affairs, works of art restitution claims. Given these developments, responsibility for defining Moscow's policy with respect to Poland was taken over by the Russian Foreign Ministry and Russia's secret services, none of these institutions being interested in solving any of the disputable issues. Under the present-day circumstances, no opportunity can be identified for turning the situation into one beneficial for the Republic of Poland in 2013-14.
Relacje dopuszczając ją nawet do
What it means is that Poland was making offers, entering into a dialogue, willing to build partnership relations with Russia, to the extent that Russia was admitted to some of the major secrets of Poland's internal and external policies.
I ten obraz placówki w
On the other hand, though, we can see that the hand whose fist is gradually clenching, if there had ever been a hand, is withdrawing. The image of the Polish outpost in Moscow of the situation shared by the whole embassy staff features permanent tracing, the building being encircled by a dozen cameras of the Federal Security Service.
przez funkcjonariuszy FSB.
The personnel was put under overt surveillance, initially electronic and then personal, done by FSB officers. Together with it, essentially, the struggle against Poland in the international arena.
I pomimo tego, że to jest bardzo ważny dokument, jeden z najważniejszych, jeden z pierwszych, które pokazują
All that was put on paper and then sent to the Foreign Ministry's headquarters. And despite this being a very important document, one of the first ones to show the doubts in a rather subtle manner, it caused no shock whatsoever in the ministry, governed by Donald Tusk. Poland blindly tried to warm up the relationship and intensify the reset with Russia, in spite of all those problems and obstacles, ignoring the clenching fist. Why was that?
No stawiasz mnie w bardzo trudnej sytuacji. Nie mam się gdzie to...
You're putting me in quite an awkward position with no room for me to step back. So let me put it in a different way, so as to avoid anybody's being named or affected.
To się mieści tylko i wyłącznie w wytłumaczeniu...
To my mind, it can only be explained in terms of a pro-Russian inclination prevalent at that time in Poland. There is no such Russia. They apparently reckoned with which Warsaw should cool the relationship in order to make it a partnership relation.
Stosunki ochłodzić po to, żeby przejść na etap stosunków partnerskich albo...
Or for Poland to pursue a policy of clearly defending its sovereign decisions as part of its basic sovereign policy.
Decyzji swojej suwerennej polityki.
Well, we don't have access to any specific document. Okay, we've seen one that was made in Moscow. Yet, things are standing out. It was a moment when matters were being decided, including personal careers of those who pursued the reset policy. There were negotiations held earlier on for appointing the head of NATO. We haven't mentioned it in our series yet. Radosław Sikorski did run for the post. The offer was open for some time. And there was the question of who will join the top authorities of the European Union and European Commission. Actually, the chair of the European Council was in play. Well, if I were to accept your interpretation, I find it rather difficult, as accepting such a point of view is something terrible, given the potential consequences. But, if I did, I would have to state the following.
Tak, reset po roku 2011.
The reset policy after 2011, which is after the second election won by a civic platform, was only propelled and incentivized by the will to keep Polish policies in line with the German policy or European policy, merely for Premier Tusk to get to a European acceptance for his own candidacy as king or president of Europe, which is a plausible hypothesis.
Królem czy prezydentem Europy. Jest to hipoteza prawdopodobna, chociaż
But let me repeat, horrible enough for me to clearly state it, but it does not make sense. Based on what I know, Professor Rotfeld was the second after Ambassador Zajączkowski to have drafted a document that expressed a critical stance on the reset policy, which he had co-created, mind you. But he did it in a communistic fashion, so to say, the way Mr. Rotfeld was educated into and the way he functioned throughout his life. What I mean is, even though he might not have liked something, he would criticize it in some skillful and delicate way, while proposing conclusions contrary, as it were, to the entire argument. Based on my years of observation, I have come to the conclusion that, contrary to what is commonly believed, Russia's foreign policies are not based on a thought-over and long-term strategy. Rather than that, the decisions this country makes tend to be reactive, not infrequently extemporary and intuitive. Russia's policy is propelled by fear of change and determined based on deeply rooted complexes. Importantly, Russia's policy is addressed and oriented towards Russian society rather than in view of responses from external partners. It is essentially a revisionist policy, one that aims, wherever possible, to reinstate the status quo ante, to regain its lost status as a global superpower on a par with the United States and China. Poland's policy toward Russia turned up to be admirably efficient. This provides a chance for Poland to develop an overall key role in the shaping of a strategy for the West in its entirety. We are now facing a unique opportunity to win over for such a policy not only the CEE countries, but also the central states within the EU and NATO, who may finally acknowledge for the first time that Poland is capable of dealing with its eastern neighbour even better than its allies might have expected. Let me remind you that even earlier on, when opinions were voiced by the chairman of the National Remembrance Institute, that there are circles in Russia which are ready to cooperate with Poland, not just the memorial milieu. He responded rather skeptically, not to say scornfully, to such naive stories, as he was aware and indeed stressed the fact that Putin was tightening the screws. But after 2012, once Putin returned as president of the Russian Federation, a number of other events were occurring around this fact. As a matter of fact, any further warming up of Polish-Russian relations was pointless, and everything that had been achieved as the greatest success for Rotfeld himself and for the whole circle revolved around the date of the 7th of April 2010, and has in fact remained so, meaning Putin's visit to Katyn. Oh yes, they are still presenting it in this way. We know much more, based on our film and its underlying documents, about the actual course of the 7th of April 2010 commemorations. But they, those orphans of Mr. Reset, point out those joint celebrations as the only circumstantial thread that they are still somehow trying to forge into a success story. Celebrations of what, namely? Well, let's say an anniversary of the massacre of Polish army officers, though I have doubts as to whether such was actually the intention on the part of Russia. The presence of the two prime ministers at the Katyn Memorial Site on the 7th of April 2010 is shown by them as the reset's climax, a major success. As we look at the concept of reset as declared by Premier Tusk in October 2007 in the context of the time horizon marked by the 7th of April 2010, we see a rather short period of time, after which the Polish party should have, so to put it, taken in sail and do one's own job, which didn't happen at all.
idea ruskiego miru, w jakimś sensie ja wiem, że to co innego oznacza. Od Władywostoku do Lizbony miała się
The idea of Ruski Mir means something different, actually. Vladivostok to Lisbon, yes. It wasn't meant to end right here.
Skupionych wokół prezydenta Bronisława
Such
Komorowskiego
was Medvedev's plan.
w czasie
Unfortunately, in the year 2010, still in the year 2011, some of the members of the Polish elite, particularly those gathered around the president Bronisław Komorowski, sent signals in the course of the talks with Russians, the strategic dialogue with Patrushev, that they considered Medvedev's plan a good point of departure for a discussion on the future, basically worldwide security architecture with Russia, being empowered to the extent that it should actually co-build the said architecture. The West, meaning the USA, recognized at some point that there is a conflict between Medvedev and Putin, and so all those Medvedev slogans regarding a transformation and modernization of Russia needed to be supported, that Russia will never quit international dialogue being the basic tool in resolving international disputes.
Oczywistym celem polityki rosyjskiej
All those fables Medvedev told, also when in Lisbon, were taken in Washington at face value. Meanwhile, an obvious goal of Russian politics has always been to disunite the allies within NATO and within the EU. But NATO is more important at this point. The other goal being to have the Americans removed from the European continent, to remove that security guarantee whose removal would deprive Europe from its deterring and responding potential, its military capacities and its force. Europe would simply no more have the potential to quickly and efficiently react to any conflict on the continent or in the areas directly surrounding the European security zone. This is, in any case, a remnant of the former Soviet policy. For instance, the power rapprochement between the Federal Republic of Germany and the Soviet Union can be dated back to the 1970s. Its development took place in the subsequent decade. That strategic dialogue between the FRG and the USSR was so serious and so advanced that probably the #1 advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the then USSR President, Mr. Yakovlev, was in a position to write a note for Gorbachev stating that what the German policy's objective was. Based on his talks with a high-ranking German official, he namely stated that Germany's aim, convergent with what the USSR pursued, was to finally clear the Americans out of the European continent. The reset was fading away, step by step. First, the Magnitsky Act was adopted in the US, the first major sanctions law. Then, the Russian Federation annexated Crimea, and in 2022, it started a full-scale war in Europe. During the ongoing war, 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. What actually happened remains unknown. Nonetheless, when you talk today to those architects of the Lisbon to Vladivostok zone, whose backbone was to be the Nord Stream project, it becomes clear that they haven't quit cherishing their concept of keeping Europe clear of the United States, of the US armed forces. For Poland, such a concept is death-dealing. It is tantamount to the loss of the country's independence, since it is made clear, based on the talks with German politicians and others too, that in their mindsets, a Europe without the United States is still on the agenda. A change in the political circumstances is what it takes for a reset policy to be resumed.
Znowu.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni, i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym kochanym.